Good evening, everyone. Welcome. We are very excited to have you all with us this evening for our second Art and Science Cafe with Dr. Haller. And tonight we are going to be transported back to the 16th century as Dr. Haller walks us through a very well-known painting known as the School of Athens. And so we're going to explore the concept of competition and collaboration in the Vatican. And if Dr. Haller looks just a little winded to you, it's because tonight we asked him to be in two places at once. He's just gave opening remarks for our 49th Maine Biomedical and Biological Sciences Symposium. So this is the largest gathering of science students and scientists in the state of Maine. This year, again, will be virtual. And so we are running a 3-day event, and we're very excited to be able to kick that off this evening too. So Dr. Haller's got lots on his plate tonight, but we're really excited to have him with us and talk a little bit about art. So Dr. Haller, welcome.
Thank you, Terry. First for the introduction and for the gin tonic, which helps me to places at the same time. Thank you.
You're supposed to tell my secret of keeping you going in two places at once.
Okay, welcome everybody. We will have an hour of art and science, and you can see the painting we'll deal with and the painter who painted it, and a couple of people who are on the painting. As Jerry already mentioned, it's called the School of Athens. It has been painted in Rome between 1508 and 1511. There are lots of people on that painting, and it was painted by a young man, Raphael da Urbino. We'll talk about him a little bit, and I'll try to introduce you into the painting. Now, why this painting? First of all, it's a campus, and I love campuses. I think I love MDIBL campus, and I think meeting places of scientists, of students, and this is what we see here. This is what it's all about. I like the solitude of sitting at a desk and writing. I like the solitude of a lab or the interaction with scientists in the lab. But most of all, I think it's about discussions, and it's about ideas and how ideas are born. And this is all depicted on that painting. So we are in the Vatican, and some of you have been in Rome, and you have been to the Vatican, and the 1500s is exactly a time where the old Vatican, which you can see here, this is St. Peter's Church, and this is the old tower, this is the old entrance to the Basilica. This is exactly the time when this building was demolished. And the building you can see here was started and built over the next 150 years. A lot of buildings were started during that time, and it took then about 150 years to finish it. And we all know that St. Peter, the cupola is from Michelangelo, that this part here, the colonnades, from Bernini, built by Bernini, are from the 17th century. But we will concentrate on two buildings here on this side where you see the circles around. And one is the Papal Palace, and the other is the Sistine Chapel. And these two buildings were actually decorated and with fresco painting at the same time, and this will be part of the story we are going to talk about. There were lots of activities in Rome at the time: new churches, new palaces, as already mentioned, new streets. Parts of the city were completely changed, and the popes were very influential. This gives you a little bit, and I will be brief about that, of the situation in Italy at that time. We had the popes. We'll talk about Julius II, who became pope in 1503, died in 1513, and Leo X who was Pope for 10 years, one from the della Rovere family and the other Leo X from the Medici. You can see that the papal states were far larger than the Vatican and reached up to the north to Bologna. And during that time, lots of warfare. This was not only for increasing the papal states and fighting Florence and the Republic of Siena, but also forces from outside. And in France, it was François Le Premier who wanted to have more influence in Italy. And from the German Spanish side, it was Charles V. So I'm not going to all this, but Julius II, elected in 1503, was a very powerful pope. He not only started all these buildings, but he fought wars. And his name, Julius II, is not a normal name of the Pope, but he actually called himself Julius after Julius Caesar because he thought he was a great statesman and general. Here we see him, a painting by Raphael. He was already elderly when he became Pope. The beard he wore because he had just lost a war, 1510, and he had sworn, I will only have a razor after I've beaten the French again. But it took some time, as you can see from the beard. This is a famous portrait in the National Gallery in London of Pope Julius II. Actually, a lot of portraits of popes during the next 200 years were made after this famous portrait. Now, the first building or the first painting we're going to talk about is in the private apartments, the stanza, which is apartment in room in Italian, in the Papal Palace. You can see it here. And this part here overlooking the Belvedere, which is actually the garden which was built at the time with all the antique statues in them, this was decorated by Julius. He moved in after the Borgias, that was the Pope before him, had left, and he hated the Borgias, so he wanted to have new decoration, and these are his rooms. And one of these rooms is shown here. This is the Stanza della Segnatura. This is the room where they stamped bulls, letters written by the Pope, but it was the place where his library was situated. Now, I've already told you that Julius II was more into warfare and more a general, but nonetheless, he had to have a library, and he definitely wanted the library to be represented in the paintings which we see on the wall. So the first wall painted by Raphael was on the left-hand side, and this is the Parnassus, and the second was then the School of Athens, which you can see here. So when Julius II opened a book, he was actually looking at this painting, and it was all about science and philosophy. It was the first painting where actually a story was told about philosophy and science. Because before that, we had only allegories. And you can see this here. This is the ceiling of the Stanza della Segnatura. And here you can see up there, that's Philosophia. So that's philosophy as an allegory. And down here, you can see a little bit of the School of Athens. So this is old-fashioned. You can see the gold mosaic. This was done by Pinturicchio. And then Raphael was called from Florence. We'll go into that in a couple of minutes. And he started this painting. Now, what do we see on the painting? Lots of people. We see a big architecture. There was a hot debate in art history whether this is actually the first design of St. Peter by Bramante, or whether it's Roman baths, or whether it's Etruscan, but nonetheless, it's big architecture. And then we have all sorts of people walking, discussing, sitting by themselves. And when we try to understand what's happening there, we start with the two in the middle. You can see the two, one in red and the other in blue. And these are the two most famous philosophers of the time. On the left-hand side, you see Platon with the one of the dialogues, the Timeo, in his hands, and he points upwards to the realm of ideas. And on the right-hand side, we see Aristotle with the ethics in his hand, and he has his hand, so he is actually covering the earth. So the two of them, these two famous philosophers, are the center. And we'll come back to this in a moment when we talk about other contemporary people. Platon looks like this famous painting we have from Leonardo da Vinci from that time. And this will also become important because he had an influence on Raphael. Now, what else do we see? We are now on the left-hand side of the picture, and one easily recognizes this philosopher here because it's Socrates. And he has the hands here, like this is what we expect a philosopher to do, arguing. And he's arguing, sorry about that. He's arguing with Alcibiades. This is this youth, good-looking, in armor. This is the general from Athens who actually learned from Socrates. And then there are others around them listening to what Socrates has to tell us. And when we go further, we have down the stairs several others. We have Pythagoras, I'm sorry, that's not Euclid. We have Pythagoras, which is writing in a book, and we have arithmetics in front of him. And when we go to the right-hand side, to this group here, we have more science. Here we have Euclid, and we have here Ptolemaeus, who has the earth, the globe, and we have here the night globe. This is Zoroaster. This is Iranian philosopher. And here we have the young students listening and watching what Euclid is designing here on the floor. And they are arguing, they're discussing, they are listening. All together, we have a very lively atmosphere demonstrating all aspects of not only philosophy and science at the time, but also students and teachers. You can see here in the middle, I didn't mention this, Diogenes, with only a little bit clothes on, sitting on the stairs all by himself, and we have others moving up and down the stairs. The colors are wonderful because they make the whole scene very lively, and the interactions between these different people gives an impression of activity. Now the question is, who was responsible for such a program? Who came up with the idea to have a painting on philosophy and science and combining actually art, because this is what the painting is all about, with science? Was it Pope Julius II? Not very likely. He was very powerful, but he was better at warfare than at designing complex programs like this. Or was it Raphael? You see here on the right-hand side, Raphael at the time. We'll come back to this. Also not very likely because he was really very young and not that well trained. Most likely, and this is a very nice book by Glenn Most, who was at the time at Chicago, no, at the time in Berlin, actually, a professor not of art history, but of Greek language. Most likely the program is from Aegidius da Viterbo. He was the prior of the Augustinians. He was well learned, he was well read, and he was actually responsible not only for the library of Pope Julius II, but he was one of the weapons he used. For instance, when he had big problems at the council in 1512, he sent Aegidius to give the opening speech, and he convinced everybody, and then afterwards it went successfully for Pope Julius II. And what he actually did, Aegidius da Viterbo, he used one of the texts from Platon and used this as the basis for the painting. And Most in his book very nicely describes the scenery of how these philosophers and scientists met in Athens. And one can easily see when one looks into the translation of this text from Platon that this was the source for the painting, and then it was translated for Raphael, and he could paint. So who was Raphael? We see him here. He was born in 1482 in Umbria. He studied in Perugia. And here you see him at different ages. And the last one, 1519, on the right-hand side, is a year before he died very young. So he studied in Perugia with Pietro Perugino. And you can see a painting which is now in France by Perugino. And on the left-hand side, you see Raphael. This is the Marriage of Mary. It's a famous painting in the Brera in Milan, 1504. And you can immediately recognize that one was the pupil of the other. Perugino was much older at that time, and he trained Raphael. But you can also see that Raphael, even at this young age already, was a master by himself. He used all what Perugino taught him and made a wonderful novel painting out of it. And he did this during the first 20 years of his life. In 1505, he went to Florence, and Florence at that time was the meeting place where Michelangelo had come back from Rome and Leonardo had come back from Milan. And both of them were hired by the city of Florence to paint in the town hall. On the one side, they wanted to have a painting by Michelangelo, the Battle of Cascina. And on the other side, they wanted to have a painting by Leonardo called the Battle of Anghiari. Both paintings are lost. Actually, Michelangelo never started the painting. We only have the cartoon, and you see here a copy by Sangallo. And the other one may be still there, we don't know, but it's now covered by a big painting, a large painting by Vasari, and the Italians are still fighting whether the Leonardo is below that Vasari painting. To be honest, even if it's there, Leonardo was so experimental with his colors that most likely it's in a very bad shape if it has survived at all. Michelangelo was famous at the time because he had just finished the David. standing in front of the town hall. And you can easily see that even when he did painting, he was a sculptor. So Raphael learned more from Leonardo during that time, and he was heavily influenced, and you can see this when you compare these two paintings. On the left-hand side, we have 1505, the Madonna in the Meadows, now in the museum in Vienna. And on the right-hand side, we have the inventor of this typical scene of Mary with two children. Here we have one angel added to it, and the triangle, which was originally from Leonardo. So the Virgin of the Rocks, 1486, and the Louvre in Paris, and you know, perhaps the other version, which is in London. This is what influenced Raphael at that time, and several of the Madonnas. You can see here La Belle Jardinière, which is in the Louvre, 1507. It's, you could say, always the same, high variability, but nobody painted Madonnas better. And on the right-hand side, you can see the Cowper Madonna from the National Gallery in DC. So this is what influenced Raphael, and then at the young age, born in 1482, and in 1508, he was called to Rome. Before we go to Rome and we go to the school of Athens, he also learned a little bit from Michelangelo. You can see here the Pietà in St. Peter's, and on the left-hand side, a famous painting which he did for a family in Perugia, the Baglioni family. That's the Deposition, 1507. You can see here this arm of Christ, and this resembles this arm. And you can see this lady here, and art historians have found that this figure here is related to the Tondo Doni, which was painted by Michelangelo in Florence. But it's much less than the influence of Leonardo. So after that, Pope Julius II asked Raphael to come to Rome, and this was the first big fresco he started. I said actually the second, because as I said, he done in the same room, he did another fresco first, but then he started on this famous painting. The program, as we discussed, from Egidio da Viterbo, the mastership by Leonardo. But it's very interesting that he not only painted the scientists from antiquity, but he also included persons from 1500s. When we look at this here, you can see here the portrait of Francesco Maria della Rovere. He was the Duke of Mantua. He was the nephew of Julius II, and he is right here in the middle of the painting. And on the right-hand side, you see a portrait which is in the Uffizi in Florence. Very good-looking young man, contemporary of the School of Athens. And when we look at this man here, which is on the left side of the painting, this is a portrait of Tommaso Inghirami, a very colorful person in Rome at the time. He was the head of the Vatican Library, and we can see him writing here. He was well known for his rhetorics, and he loved theater. And he could fill with his voice a whole theater all by himself. Here, I've described this person as Euclid before, but as in the case of Leonardo da Vinci, which resembles Platon, here we have Euclid and disguised as Bramante. Bramante was the protector, one of the mentors of Raphael in the Vatican. He was the architect of of St. Peter at that time, and he's shown here while making an architectural design, a geometric design on the floor. And then, in addition to these contemporaries of Raphael, he painted himself. Here you can see him on the right-hand side. This is Raphael, and this is his partner, the painter Sodoma. And here there are the two of them, and you can see this is a very nice portrait where Raphael displayed himself. Besides all these important scientists of antiquity and his contemporaries, his friends in the Vatican. I shouldn't say friends, I think they're part of the program, so I think you had to be rather famous or well-liked by the Pope or Egidio to be part of that program. And then we have another person, another contemporary of Raphael, and this is, as a philosopher, Heraclitus, and as a person, Michelangelo. He was 36 years of age at that time, and the question is, how does Michelangelo get into this painting? My first interest in this person was as a medical doctor, because when you look at the person, not well dressed, but then for a medical doctor, mostly the knees are interesting. These knees look terrible. So the question is, what has happened to these knees? You can see him sitting in here, and he was the last figure added to the painting. First, when we look at the knees, the differential diagnosis is it could be gout. And actually, there is an article in The Lancet which described these knees as gouty knees, which I, as a medical doctor, do not agree with, because Michelangelo became very old. And since we had no real treatment for gout at the time, and we have actually no reports in any of his letters or in his diaries, and he wrote a lot, I don't think it's very likely that he has high uric acid and is suffering from gout. The second problem could be arthrosis. That's possible, especially when, and we will discuss this in a moment, when we think about the work Michelangelo had been doing during the last 3 years. The most likely diagnosis, I think, and when you compare these pictures, I think you will agree, is that he was suffering from venous thrombosis, rather severe superficial thrombi. And I think this comes from his profession, his work in the 3 years before the School of Athens was finished. It's very interesting that on the last cartoon, and the cartoon is the drawing which was made by Raphael in order to prepare for the painting. So this is the same size as the painting, and these are the drawings, and the cartoons were used because they made little holes into the cartoon, and then they had colors through these little holes so they knew where they had to paint. This cartoon is now in Milan, in the Biblioteca Ambrosiana, and it's obvious, although everybody's on the cartoon, there is no Michelangelo. So the cartoon is from the spring of 1511, and the question then is, what happened in 1511 that all of a sudden Michelangelo shows up on this cartoon, on the fresco? And this is what happened. In the summer of 1511, the first scaffold was removed, and the first mass was held in the Sistine Chapel after Michelangelo had been working in there on the first half of the ceiling for the last 3 years. He was also asked by Julius II, and I've already told you that he started lots of activities. He was asked from Florence to come to Rome, and first he was asked to be a sculptor for the tomb of Julius II. But then Julius changed the job description and asked him to paint the ceiling. And to be honest, Michelangelo was not thrilled. You have seen that he had painted before, although mostly cartoons or this one painting, the Tonto Doni, but painting the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, that was quite different. So he asked for a couple of people to join him from Florence to help him with that. As I said, he was not very happy about that. He was arguing with the Pope about that, about payments and all that. And in the beginning, it was a disaster because fresco, as you know, means that you have to prepare al fresco, the area you want to paint on during the day. And then the next day, you have to make al fresco again. So the plaster you're putting there has to be firm. And in the beginning, because they didn't know that the sand in Rome was different from the sand in Florence, it all came down from the ceiling. So this was not a good and not an easy start. And you can imagine the scaffolding was hard. It's very high up. It was dangerous to do that. And this is what Michelangelo suffered. This is the second half of the ceiling. This was done then a year later. And the big fresco at the end, which you can see on the wall, was actually done then more than 20 years later by Michelangelo as well. It's a wonderful chapel. The paintings on the side were done in the 1480s when they had started to work on the chapel, and this was ordered by Pope Sixtus. This is why it's called Sistine Chapel. Michelangelo, we have already seen the David, which he carved up to 1504 in Florence, and then the very famous Pietà in the Vatican. He was a sculptor. He painted a little bit. You have seen already the Tonto Doni, and when you look at his paintings, it's all sculpture. You can see the naked bodies in the back of this painting. This is what the Sistine Chapel looked like before he started. The ceiling was in blue, was covered by stars. The whole building was a little bit fragile. It had to be stabilized during the years. And you can see how high up he had to build a scaffold and paint. And he painted a lot of sculpture on that ceiling. This shows you the first half of the ceiling. And this is what Raphael saw when he entered the church in 1511 in the summer. There are lots of stories about the relationship between the two. The two most famous painters, besides Leonardo, of Renaissance, of high Renaissance in Rome, have been painting almost in the same building. It's only 2 staircases from the stanza, from the apartments of Julius II to the Capella Maggiore, to the Sistine Chapel. And some of the stories are that Michelangelo, who was mostly in a bad mood, protected his frescoes and nobody let them see. And there's one story where Raphael tried to see it and Bramante stole the keys and let him in. And they were competitors. They were fighting. And there is a lot which supports this story, as you will see later on in their history. But Raphael was not only a famous painter, but he knew quality. And you have seen before that he copied. When he was working with Perugino, he copied and he learned. He was learning from Leonardo in Florence, and he learned immediately when he saw the ceiling. So I think Raphael, in fact, was seriously impressed, and he painted Michelangelo into the school of Athens immediately, although he was not on the original cartoon. Coming back to the knees, on the right-hand side, you see a drawing by Michelangelo where he has made a small sketch of himself painting the ceiling. And he has written a heartbreaking poem to a friend in Pistoia about how hard it was and how he had to bend himself and how he was on his knees. Here is more stretched, paint in his eyes for 3 years, complaining that he will die from this painting. So I think at least there is an association with this hard work and the possibility of thrombosis in his legs. And here you see what Raphael saw when he came in the summer of 1511 into the Sistine Chapel. This is the impressive paintings. And here you see the prophets. And here you see another prophet, Jeremiah. And here you see the famous Sibyls, which Michelangelo had painted on the ceiling. And what Raphael did is he looked at them, I think he copied them, and then he used them. So he was not only fighting with Michelangelo about who is the best, but he was also learning from him. And almost immediately after he saw the ceiling in the Sistine Chapel, he painted in Santa Maria della Pace. This is also in Rome. That's on the other side of the river. If you walk towards the Piazza del Popolo, you come towards this wonderful church. And inside there is a chapel called the Chigi Chapel. Chigi was one of the richest men, supported the Pope, and built his tomb in this church. And here you can see up there the fresco by Raphael, which he painted for Chigi. He did much more for Chigi. He also painted in the Villa Farnesina, which was the villa of Chigi. But here you can see very clearly when you look at these Sibyls from Raphael, and you look especially at this one here, and you compare it to the Persian Sibyl by Michelangelo. I've shown you here 2 examples. So this is Raphael, and these are 2 Sibyls from Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel. And I don't think that you have to be, I don't think it's hard to convince you that both the legs, you see this here, and the turning of the body, and the whole sculptural quality of what Raphael has painted is seriously influenced by Michelangelo. And this also happened on the other side. This is another Sibyl by Raphael, and this is the Libyan Sibyl, famous from Michelangelo, and you can see both the legs and the arms and the turning of the body. This is directly Michelangelo by Raphael. So far from being a competitor only, I think this was about working together and about seeing what's great in painting and using it in your own paintings. And there are a couple of other examples. This is this famous scene where Godfather touches the finger of Adam. And you can see this figure here in one of the other rooms of Julius II, Raphael painted. And even when he painted Michelangelo himself, he was using an example of one of the prophets Michelangelo had painted on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. So far more complex relationship, and this is more how I understand the School of Athens and how I understand what the interaction between Raphael and Michelangelo. And now let me come to the last example of this complex relationship. And this is now the fall of 1519. This is 8 years after the first part of the Sistine Chapel had been finished. It's 6 years after all of the Sistine Chapel had finished, and Raphael had made a remarkable career during that time in Rome. He was not only the most famous painter now, he had been given the job of being the architect of St. Peter's. He was painting, you can see here a couple of examples in the Vatican. He was painting for the Chichi family, but also for others. He was responsible for a large villa outside of Rome called Villa Madama, which is now owned by the foreign minister in Italy, and all the guests of Italy are housed in that villa. And in addition to that, he was responsible for archaeology. Everything which was excavated in Rome at the time had to be presented to Raphael, and I don't know where he took the energy from, but he was making the first catalog of all the antiques in Rome of that time. In addition to that, he was well known for his relationships, for his amorous relationships. And here you can see one of his lovers called La Fornarina. She was the daughter of a baker. And on the right-hand side, you can see Raphael was one of his friends. He had a very famous circle of friends, and they were working together. And during that time, he was not only doing all the things I just described, he was painting his last painting. And this last painting was ordered by one of the nephews of the new Pope. As you have seen before, as you've heard before, Julius II died in 1513, and then Leo X, one of the Medici, became Pope. And these are his two cardinals. And this is Giulio de' Medici. And Giulio de' Medici became Pope in 1523, Clemens VII. But at the time he was a cardinal, and he had several churches and income from these churches, and one was in Narbonne in France. And he ordered a painting for the main altar of the church in Narbonne, and being competitive himself, he ordered it from two painters. One was Sebastiano del Piombo. So he asked Sebastiano, who was originally from Venice, you can see this a little bit by the colors, he was mentored by Michelangelo. And he was a pupil of Michelangelo, and Michelangelo had brought him from Venice to Rome. And the Cardinal Giulio de' Medici ordered a painting from Sebastiano for Narbonne. And Sebastiano chose the Raising of Lazarus, a painting which is now in the National Gallery in London. You can see that the background, the landscape is very Venetian, but you can also see, very interesting, that he was actively supported by Michelangelo. So while Sebastiano del Piombo was the painter, Michelangelo provided, and you can see on the right-hand side here, one of the sketches here of Lazarus himself. And this is a sketch from Michelangelo. So we know from letters that Sebastiano was asking Michelangelo to help him in this competition with Raphael, because Raphael was the second painter who was asked by the cardinal, by Giulio de' Medici, to provide a painting. So he set these two camps, one Sebastiano del Piombo from the Michelangelo camp, and the Raphael camp at each other and let them compete. Raphael didn't work on the painting. He actually only started in 1519, while Sebastiano del Piombo had already been working for a year. And here we have now serious competition, because Sebastiano, when he wrote about what he could see from the Raphael painting, he wrote to Michelangelo and he said, "You would hate what you see on this painting. We are much better." But this painting by Raphael is very impressive. It's his last painting. It's the Transfiguration of Christ, and he tried to outdo himself. And while I was mentioning a lot that he painted and he learned from others, this is now very original, all of it. We have two parts in this painting. The above part, the upper part is Christ, very light, very bright, as you can see here, surrounded by saints. Excuse me. And you can actually see how these saints and his pupils can't see because of the light. So this is Raphael. Some of you may know the Sistine Madonna, and she is also on clouds, and this is invention of Raphael. Nobody has done this before. And these two saints next to him is also very original. And the lower part is very original. This is very dramatic. This is the pupils of Christ, and they are down there. And he actually composed, or he brought together two stories and made a painting out of two stories which are actually not directly connected. And he added this beautiful woman there, with most likely as Mary Magdalene. We are not sure about that. But then you look at these interactions, and in our last talk, we mentioned the liveliness of the Rembrandt painting, and this all comes from Raphael. The movements of the hand, the interactions, it's far more lively after 100 years later by Rembrandt, but here the interaction, and they all point to this boy who actually who has a problem. The boy on the right-hand side is held by his father. His mother is next to him. And as I said, this boy is not healthy. First, I'll show you some of the drawings Raphael did, and these drawings are famous. And he was famous for these drawings all over Europe. In fact, Albrecht Dürer, far away in Nuremberg, sent one painting to Raphael across the Alps, and he received one sketch by Raphael, and he was very proud to have this. And here you see the movement of the hands, you see how lively the faces are, and this is what Raphael had achieved, even at this young age, learning from all the masters around him. And I mentioned the boy, and the boy has a medical problem, and the boy has a seizure. And here you see the drawing for this part of the painting. And on the left-hand side, I'm showing you all the signs and symptoms of a grand mal seizure. And everything is in this boy. So Raphael, and he did this all by himself, he must have had a clear understanding what it looks like. There is confusion. There is a sudden fall. You can see that he is falling actually. If his father wouldn't hold him, he would fall to the ground. There is staring. The eyes are wide open. There are uncontrollable jerking movements, and you can see this here with the hands and this arm here. The strange sensations and emotions, we are only able to see wide open mouth and loss of consciousness and awareness. this is also something we can deduce from this painting. So this brings, in a very different way, science and art together. Because in order to be able to do this, you can't just sit in front of the paper and start drawing. You have to have information. You have to talk to doctors. You have to have books where this disease is described. As we know, epilepsy was a holy disease. It was known and has been known for a long time. So a description of the disease were available in Greek and Roman texts. Since Raphael couldn't read Greek texts himself, he needed translation for that. And as in the case of Egidius da Viterbo, you remember who made the program for the School of Athens, it was here the circle of Raphael friends who met regularly, who were famous in Rome. And I've told you that he was responsible for all the antiquities in Rome. So this is his science. And since then, medical doctors have used this painting by Raphael for a description. And when I went to medical school, the neurologist who taught me epilepsy, one of the first slides he used was actually Raphael and moonstruck, because it was a disease related to the moon. And I will not go into that in detail, but when you look at the painting here, there are details like the moon reflected here in the water. And there is a very nice description and analysis by one of my professors in the 70s in Berlin, that this has to do with the Turkish and the Turkish threat to Rome in 1518, because a Turkish fleet was actually in front of Rome, and the Pope on one occasion was almost captured by the Turks during this time in Italy. So we could go on and talk about this a long time, but here you have these two paintings next to each other. And after all my descriptions, you know who won by far. In fact, Sebastiano del Piombo, his painting was not really displayed, but Raphael then did a very interesting PR thing. He died. He died just when the painting was finished. And then his body was on display and the painting was sitting next to it. And most of the people of Rome, they came by because he was famous and they saw the painting. And from then on, this has been one of the most famous paintings by Raphael. It's now in the Vatican. You can see it after you have seen tons of other paintings there. You will be exhausted because first you have to see a lot of Madonnas, and then you see the Transfiguration of Christ. And then an hour later, you arrive in the Sistine Chapel. And even after that, you arrive where you can see and watch the School of Athens. As I said, Raphael died in April of 1520. This is Raphael's tomb in the Pantheon, and I've already talked about the association with his last painting. So I think we are at the end of our talk. To be honest, I have no watch at the moment. I think we're still on time. We have talked about Raphael, we have talked about Michelangelo, and I tried to talk and to explain to you why I really love this painting so much. It's, as I said, the first painting where academia is displayed at a time when academia was coming back to life again in the Renaissance, where we have a mix of old philosophers and scientists and young ones, where we have students and interaction of student and professors. And you may forgive me, when I look at the School of Athens, I think of MDIBL and about our campus. Thank you very much for your attention.
Dr. Haller, that was perfect. It is 5:58, so you have a great sense of timing. Thank you very much for a very, just very informative talk. There was a ton of information in there, so thank you so much. I think we're a small enough group that if folks have questions, you can simply unmute yourself if you'd like to ask your question of Dr. Haller. I know I have felt like I just, went back to Italy. I've been trying desperately to convince Dr. Haller to take us all on a guided tour of all of the art museums in Italy. So I could use your help advocating for that. I think it would be fun. So anyone have any questions?
Were there schools of medicine at that time and hospitals as we know them now?
Yes, very much so. To be honest, when we go back, and we'll have lectures where we talk more about hospital organization and medical education, one of the first modern schools of medicine were in the 1200s in Sicily, Frederick II, and you know that I have been involved in medical education for quite a while. And when I read the book on how they organized medical education in Salerno at that time, this was 1250, it's not that much different from us. You had to look after patients, and you had to obey the rules. You could fail the exams 2 times. When you failed them a 3rd time, there was no chance. You didn't become a medical doctor. A lot of the texts they had at the time came from the Middle East. So there was a strong Arabian influence in medicine at that time. And you can see this here as well, because here, when you look on this side here, we talked about Pythagoras. You have here Muslim influence during that time as well, with the turban and everything. So yes, there was medical education. However, the diagnosis they made or the explanations they had were different. We have from the same time very interesting, very detailed anatomical sketches, as you know, from Leonardo, very detailed with all the arteries, etc. But in our last lecture, we talked about William Harvey. This was 1636. Only at that time, they realized that there was blood circulation. So although they had a detailed knowledge of anatomy, the interaction of the different organs was very different. At that time, they saw that the liver was the source of blood. They had no idea about red blood cells and the bones. They saw that the blood originated in the liver and then was transported to the heart, and in the heart it exploded and then went into the periphery, and then it disappeared, and then it was remade, so to speak, with every heartbeat in the liver again. So that was the understanding before William Harvey. The way they treated patients, we discussed this also last time. They had surgeons and they were responsible for bleeding. They did a lot of bleeding at that time to remove toxic substances from the body. Also, sweating was very popular, and other purges of the body, inducing diarrhea was very common, and the diagnoses were limited. Epilepsy was considered to be, on the one hand, a sacred disease, but on the other hand, it was also a serious disease, and they had different treatment strategies, and they gave herbs which calmed down the person, so you didn't have that many fits. A lot of the herbs they used was based on experience, long-term experience, but they had detailed books. We'll have one lecture, I think, during the summer, where I'll present to you books, teaching books of pharmacology of the 1500s, And it's astonishing what the students had to learn.
Dr. Haller, as a physician, do you have a point of view about the cause of Raphael's death?
Well, that's a very interesting question. At the time, I have to tell you, Vasari, who was his first biographer, said it was just too many girlfriends.
I know that. That's why I'm asking the question.
He had a serious fever, and he had 3 girlfriends and all the other jobs he had, and it was just too much. And this is why he died within 3 days.
There was,
It could be malaria during that time. It's a little bit early in the year. It's April, but that's a possibility. And the third possibility, but that's actually a talk I will give also during the summer on the first pandemic in Europe in the 1500s, could be syphilis.
I was going to say, I thought there was also speculation that it could be syphilis.
Yeah, and that will be, as I said, the topic of another talk, but the first wave of syphilis we had starting in 1493, syphilis was a very different disease. And as we learn today, these bugs are changing all the time, and syphilis actually killed you. There was a chronic form of the disease, but a lot of people died from acute fever in the 1520s. So it could well have been, and this goes with the girlfriends. I mean, we don't know. This is all speculation, but shouldn't, I don't have a different picture, but Raphael in a way is very much like Jim Morrison from The Doors.
Right.
Now there's a headline that I can see in the American.
You've helped us understand about the exploration of the anatomy, the dissection, how the body functions just by observation of blood flow and those sorts of things. Was there anything such as a biological laboratory?
That's also a good question. To be honest, I don't know, not at that time in Rome. What they did is they were collecting, and you've seen this in my Rembrandt talk, they were trying to discover the world. This is 1520. The Americas were discovered, so to speak, in 1493. So there were lots of things coming, especially in Rome. And I think they were just looking at the world and not doing a lot of experiments, but just finding new things, excavating things, and no experiments. Experiments only started about 100 years later. However, Galileo, with the telescope and looking at the planets and all that, so these are a few examples, but biological sciences, I don't think so.
If you were an educated person at the time, Jerry Bowers walks in there, would you have been able to recognize all the personages that are represented in this painting?
That's a very good question. And as always, it depends on the knowledge and of the person looking at the painting. Art historians for a long time have found, that paintings were done for different audiences. And I think Pope Julius perhaps not recognized everybody, and he was too busy anyway, but at least he knew that he had a painting on his wall which was up to date, was very fashionable, and a lot of people from antiquity were on this painting. And then in addition, but this is pure speculation, they added a couple of his favorites. Like this Duke of Mantua I was talking about, he liked him a lot. So this person here in white, so he must have recognized him. He obviously recognized Plato and Aristoteles, but I'm not sure. And this guy was running his library at the time in the Vatican, but perhaps he didn't recognize all of these people over here, like Ptolemeus and Zoroaster. But it all depends on your knowledge. And it's a very interesting idea. If this is Michelangelo and he was painted in late, what did they talk about? You know, when Pope Julius came in, looked at Michelangelo and said to Raphael, so you painted him in there? And Raphael said, well, but here is this block of marble. You should have left him being a sculptor and not painting the Sistine ceiling. Perhaps I should have done that. So I don't know about these discussions, but it's interesting to speculate on that.
Fascinating. Dr. Haller, thank you so much. This was really just a great adventure. Really, really appreciate it. So your next lecture will be on June 2nd, your art and science lecture for our Starpoint Society members. Have you decided what the subject is going to be for that? You want to tell us a little bit about it?
Now we have talked about the pandemic already. We have to talk about the first pandemic, well, not the first, but the pandemic around 1500s in Europe. And we'll discuss a painting which was done in Florence in 1540, a very nude painting, I have to admit, but it's you can see it in the National Gallery as well. And some of you may have a cup or a poster because it's a famous painting. It's and we'll talk about that and the pandemic and what it meant to Europe at that time.
Can I add a question?
Yes, please.
You know, I'm wondering, when you study these things, are you reading text in the original form, or is it all interpreted and hashed over by universities and rendered in all the languages around, German and English and so on?
Yeah, well, when I studied art history, because all the texts were still, you had to know quite a few languages, I have to admit. Art historians are, the literature is in Italian. When you do Renaissance art, a lot of the literature is in Italian. When you do Dutch art, a lot of the literature is in Dutch. And when you do French art, a lot of the literature is in French, I have to admit, and in Spain. So you have a hard time as an art historian because these articles are not translated into other languages. So these days, I concentrate myself more on German and English, and my Italian is not that good anymore. But at the time, I read a lot in Italian and French.
Fascinating.
It's
Last
hard,
time, oh,
it's
sorry,
hard to imagine a scientist who has the time to indulge in all this. You know, I've been reading the Code Breakers, and as they start off with Watson and Crick and work up through, and those people don't seem to have such diverse interest.
Well, it's always the question, you know, whether you are superficial or whether you are deep. And you can see I'm doing biomedical sciences and I do art history, so this has to be superficial.
Well,
it's a great talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And yes, thank you, Dr. Haller, and thank you all for joining us tonight. We really enjoy having an opportunity to talk with all of you and our Starpoint Society members, and are so grateful for your support of the research happening at MDIBL. So thank you again. And we will definitely send out the recording of this once it's available, if you want to share that with folks who weren't able to join us tonight. And we will send out more information on the June 2nd talk as well. So thank you again. And we're looking forward to seeing you back here in Maine when you're all able to travel, and hopefully seeing some of you in person this summer. So thank you very, very much.